This is GM Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Judit Polgar at the 2014 FIDE World Blitz Championship. And the game starts off with a King's Indian defense by Judit, as it's very clear that she is playing for a win with the black pieces. Magnus responds with the same-ish variation, one of the most reputable and dangerous ways to fight the King's Indian, as we see the photographer there snapping pictures. The game's still in its opening stages. Carlsen puts his bishop on e3, his knight on e2, as is so typical in the same-ish, and Judit Polgar responds with an old variation. I believe this is called the Byron variation, or the Burn variation. She puts the pawns on a6 and c6, and the idea is to prepare an early pawn breakthrough on the queen side. Black wants to play b7, b5, and initiate a furious queenside assault to counteract what will certainly be a kingside attack from white. You can see that death there that Judit gave Magnus as he was contemplating which variation to play. A2, A4 is his choice. That, of course, stops b5, but what it does is create a big weakness on the b4 square. That is what Judit tries to exploit by pushing the a6 pawn once more to a5, establishing a stronghold on b4, and it's quite easy for black to get a knight there if she is so inclined. Knight a6, knight b4 would ensconce the knight on a very strong outpost, and that is exactly what Polgar does. As we see here, Carlsen bringing his own knight to g3 in order to make space for the development of his light-squared bishop. And what's interesting is that Carlsen has adopted a more positional approach than a lot of same-ish players generally do. He's kind of refrains from pushing the g-pawn. Instead, he's prioritized rapid development, and he might even castle kingside, especially given the fact that he has played the move a4, and that is exactly what he does. Kingside castles from Carlsen. Polgar responds by striking in the center with e5. Carlsen closes the center, pushes d5, and Polgar's still chilling on a6. She's not hurrying to put that knight on b4. Black can do that whenever she wants. h7, h5, yet another typical idea in such positions. Even though black has castled kingside, it is important to dislodge the g3 knight from its active post, and Polgar does just that, the knight dropping back to h1. And knight f6 to h5. I like the way Polgar is handling the opening. That knight from h5 can jump into f4, even at the cost of a pawn, because if white takes on f4, the King's Indian bishop on g7 would never be more happier than after the e5 pawn disappears. And let's see if Polgar goes for that pawn sacrifice or goes for a slightly more tame idea. Knight a6 to b4 would also be pretty normal here. Black's light-scored bishop isn't developed, so both sides have their share of problems in this position, and white is tremendously solid. No targets anywhere on the board for white. There is a weak square on b4, but that's basically it. And Carlsen has a relatively simple follow-up of moving his rook from f1 to d1, and once he does that, he'll have the d6 pawn in his crosshair, so Polgar has no time to waste, and waste time she does not. f7, f5, the typical King's Indian pawn advance on the king side. Now black threatens f4, which would trap white's bishop on e3. So Carlsen has to respond to that, and he can do that in one of several ways. Bishop e3 to g5 would put the bishop above and beyond the reach of black's pawn, so that would be one move. Bishop h6 is also possible if Carlsen wants to trade the dark squared bishops, but I don't think he's going to do that. Right now, his bishop is better than its counterpart on g7. He chooses instead a third option, knight f2 to d3, centralizing the knight, contesting the b4 square, and vacating the f2 square for his bishop. Now, Polgar could push her pawn to f4 and follow up with h4, h3. That does seem like a pretty scary kingside attack. Even though black is castled on the king side, it doesn't matter, but instead Polgar goes knight g3. What a move! What a move, putting the knight on pre, but if Carlsen takes it with his pawn, then Polgar recaptures with her g-pawn, and the bishop on f2 is going to be trapped, and not only that, with the h-file opened up, black could swing her queen from e7 to h4 and potentially deliver checkmate to the white king. So I don't think Carlsen is going to take that knight, and he doesn't. He moves the rook away to d1, letting that knight sit on g3. The big question, how is Polgar going to follow up on the king side? Instead, she goes c5. First, she locks up the position, and now Carlsen does take the knight. And he decides to sack the bishop back on g3, queen g5. That is his idea. And that is a brilliant concept by white, because he is inevitably going to take the pawn on g3. And that is black's main attacker. Polgar has no choice but to slide her queen to f7. First, Carlsen entrenches his own knight on his own outpost on b5. Notice that black's knight still hasn't left a6. Now he takes back on g3. Carlsen currently up a pawn, but with bishop h6, Polgar shows who is in control of the dark squares. It is black. Bishop e3 check is a very nasty threat that would drive white's king to f1. So Carlsen hesitating there as he moves his king up to f2. parrying the threat of bishop e3 and also preparing to shift his rook to h1. I feel like the h file is going to be a very important center of the battle a couple of moves down the line. And there he goes, rook h1 by Carlsen, ignoring the annoying knight on b4, which white can capture at any moment. Polgar can also decide to trade the knight on d3 and then maybe perhaps move the bishop from h6 to f4. That almost traps white's queen. Fortunately, the queen does have an escape square on h4. Now, Polgar taking a sizable think here as her clock drops down to a minute. King g7 is her choice, defending the bishop on h6. And with queen h4, Carlsen makes her an offer that black cannot refuse. A queen trade is on the blue. Queens are off the board, and white is still up a pawn. That knight on b5 is now more annoying than ever. The pawn on d6 is hanging, and Polgar is going to have to defend it. Carlsen, with rook h2, prepares to double rooks on the h-file. And all of a sudden, with the queens off the board, the attack against white's king has evaporated, and white's pressure only grows. The pawn on d6 is hanging. The rooks are about to double on the h-file, and Carlsen is going to infiltrate the 7th rank. Bishop e3 check. A lovely tactical idea by Polgar to mix things up, and she takes the rook on a1. But the problem is that after king c3, the knight on a1 is completely stranded. How is Polgar getting that knight out? She isn't. Rook h1 picks up the knight on a1. Carlsen is going to have 2 pieces and a pawn for the rook. He should be winning here. Rook takes a1, and Polgar grabs the knight on b5 finally, but it's a day late and a dollar short. Which way is Carlsen going to recapture? A takes b5, opens up the a file, but he takes with the c pawn. And I think he's going to go b3 and try to get that knight over from b2 to c4. And once the knight lands on c4, the pawn on d6 is a sitting duck. Polgar grabs control of the h-file, but with the queens off the board and the white king already on the queen side, that is more meaningless than it has been. Rook h2, a desperate attempt to generate counterplay, which Magnus calmly parries with rook g1. There goes that knight, swinging it from b2 and bishop b5. What a move! The rook on b6 is trapped. Knight c4 is coming in, and Polgar will lose the rook. She resigns the game.